Hello, my name is Keith Brown. This is the first of two videos that will demonstrate a simple, practical technique to generate and display a custom report using XML to store the results of the report for efficiency, LINQ to XML to generate it for flexibility, and declarative data binding in ASP.NET to display it for simplicity. This video will focus on the generation of the report. The next video in the series will focus on the display of that report. There's a lot of ways to generate and display these reports, and there's a lot of third-party tools for doing it too. What I'm going to show you here is how to use some of the most basic tools in the .NET framework to get started. I'm going to keep this discussion simple and very practical. So let's start by showing the output of the report that I would like to get. I've got some fake random data that I'll show you a little class that's used to generate that in a moment, but we want to take this sales reporting data that tells us for every sale, the date that the sale occurred, some demographics about it, what country it came from and how much it was, and break that down. I've been asked to break this down by month, so I need a monthly report for all of this stuff. And I need to break it down to show domestic sales and foreign sales, overall sales, and also break it down by country. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use an XML file to store the results of this report so that it's very easy to display and it displays very quickly, so we don't have to calculate this on the fly. But I'm also going to show the age of the report, which is really important because if I want to freshen it, I can do that as well. And I just think that this sort of very simple reporting architecture works really, really well, especially for simple scenarios. So before we start looking at the code, I want to focus a little bit on the XML format that we're going to end up with. So instead of really going and looking at the UI for presenting it, let's focus on the data model that we want. So we have widgets, we're selling them. We need to have a monthly breakdown, so each period is going to have a month to tell us which month the period's for. It's going to have the breakdown, the overall breakdown, domestic and foreign for that month, sales. And it's going to have the breakdown by country. It's a very simple format, and nobody has to tell you how to design this. You can design it yourself. But coming up with this to begin with is going to really help you, because from this document you're going to know how to design your UI, and from this document you're going to know what you're going to need to do to write to extract the data and produce this report from your data layer. All right, so speaking of our data layer, the data layer here is incredibly simple because I'm really focused on reporting here. So I just have a random number generator that generates some random widget sale objects. Each one of these sales knows the date that it was purchased, the amount, and the country that it came from. Just the data that we need to report, just to keep things simple. And I have a method here that will generate some data for the month. Now, in a real scenario, you'd be obviously going to a SQL database or an XML file or some more interesting data source in order to gather this information. But for our purposes, this should suit us just fine. Now, one thing that's important to note here is that the output of this method is an IEnumerable interface, which is a very LINQ-friendly interface, and it's going to help us get to LINQ really quickly. So when it comes time to actually generate this report, I have a class called the widget sales reporter, which represents the report itself. There's a static method on it that allows you to generate the report for a given period, a given set of months. And this guy knows not only how to generate the report, but it also knows where the report lives. And so we're going to need to have a property that represents that path. Now, if you were just prototyping it yourself, you could use this method that I've pasted in here, report path, that will basically just hard code the thing. But in practice, you're going to want to specify where you create these reports, and the configuration options for these are endless. I'm going to show you a very simple example. I'm going to start with a method that I find very helpful in practice called getRequiredAppSetting, and you can put this on a separate class if you want. The idea is you want to reach into your config file and pull out an app setting, and you want to throw an exception if you don't find that application setting there, because the first time you run this, it's very likely people will forget to configure it the way they need to. And I have found in practice that just throwing a very clear exception about something like this, explaining what to do when you're not configured properly, is very, very helpful. Now with that in place, we can go ahead and rewrite this report path a little bit more nicely. We can go and get at least a folder that's configurable in our app, and go ahead and put our our report right in there. And like I said, you can do this however you want. This is just a simple example, but do consider using config of some sort in order to choose where you put your reports. Now the basic structure of our generate report method is going to look something like this. We're going to basically generate some XML, e-report, let's say, equals, we'll figure out what that looks like in a minute. But once we generate that, we're going to need to save it to disk. So let's go ahead and save it to disk. We'll create a method for that. And we'll populate this method with a little bit of boilerplate code here. We're going to grab a, let's see, we're going to grab a file, create a file, using this path that we've defined so we know where the file lives. And we're going to pop an XML text writer on that. So we're going to write this out as text so that it's easy for a human to read and debug. And we're also going to format it nicely. And I think that this is worth doing. If you have performance issues, you can remove that white space. But in general, I think having that white space in your XML so that it's nicely formatted like this is much nicer than having it all on one line. It's a trade-off that I happen to like. Okay, we can build that, and it's happy. So now our job is to figure out what this report's going to look like, how to actually generate this using LINQ to XML. So now, if we go back and look at our XML document here, you can see that we need to have a root element called widget sales. So let's go ahead and start that by creating that element. So we'll create a new X element with a name of widget sales. And then we're going to put some content into that, and we need to start that content with something that generates elements. And each one of these elements that are going to be generated are going to be a period. So for each month that we have, we're going to generate a period element. So we're going to need to have something that generates that. And the way I like to do this is to just start off with LINQ right away, to start off with a generator that generates those months for us. Now I use this all the time, and I happen to have a generator handy, so I'm just going to paste it in here. This is a method called month range. You give it a start month, a start date and time that has basically a year and a month, and it ignores the day, and an end time or an end date which has a year and a month, and it will basically walk through and spit out as its output a collection of months, so one for each month. So we just go through and either add months or we subtract months depending on whether start is less than or greater than end. So if I pass in January 2009 and January 2010, this will spit out 12 months starting at January and increasing. So now I can use this to start off my report here because I want one element per month. So I can start off by saying month range. All right, I'm going to start with my start month and end month. And that's going to generate, dates for me. It's going to generate, if there's 12 dates specified, I'm going to basically get 12 of these things. And from here now, I can start transforming this into something else. I want to transform this ultimately into period elements. So if I wanted to, I could do this. I could say select, let's see, we have a month that's coming in, the current month, out of that range, and I can generate an element from that. New X element, it has a name of period, right? And I can throw an attribute in that of month, which is what we want. And that'll format it exactly like we want. And if I was to just go ahead, I can just leave this for now as like pseudocode, but you can see that this would generate the basic structure of this. So we have a widget sales root element, and then inside of that we have period child elements. Now if all we were producing was a report that just had months in it and no data in it, we'd be done. But there's something missing here. We need to actually pull the data in order to get these overall numbers, the breakdowns. We need to get all that stuff in there somehow. And this is something that people sometimes find tricky when they're using LINQ. If you're using the keyword syntax, the comprehension syntax, then you can use the let keyword to introduce new variables into your queries at any point. If you're using the extension method syntax, which I personally prefer because it's just more consistent and I can do everything I want with it. I don't have to switch styles. I kind of just prefer this method personally. It's not necessarily obvious how you introduce a new variable into your pipeline. Basically, what I want to do here is I have a month. I have a month coming through my pipeline right now, but I want something else. I want the revenue breakdown for that month as well. So I really need two pieces. I need the month and I need the details of the revenue breakdown. And the way I do that is by using an anonymous type. So I'm going to say here, I'm going to add an inject transform here, select. I'm going to take my month, I'm going to transform that into something new that has two parts. So I'm basically going to split this out and say new. I'm going to transform this into something new that has a month in it, because I need to keep that. I need to carry that along. But I also need the revenue by country, right? And I have a method that I can grab to generate that for me. And it's called compute revenue by country for month. So, bear with me for a moment. We'll define this. I'll define this method in a little bit. But assuming that we can do that, assuming we can figure out the revenue breakdown and get ourselves a table or a dictionary or whatever sort of data structure we need to represent that, then what we've effectively done here is we've started with one piece of data in our pipeline, the current month, right? So we've started enumerating over this month, and then we've injected another piece of information. We've injected the revenue breakdown for that month. So now we have effectively two variables flowing through. So now at this point, we don't really have a month here anymore. We have this new thing that has both a month and a revenue table. So I'll call this month data, right? And then when we want to display the month, we say month data dot month. Right, so we're looking at this object now. All right, so let's go ahead and define that method now. And this really is specific to your data source. I'm going to go to my little fake data source and just create a table that has is keyed off of the country code, and gives me the total the total amount of revenue for that month for that country. So we walk through every purchase in the month, which is, just going to our data source and getting that. And you might go to SQL or, whatever it is you need to go to. Here I'm just generating this random data behind the scenes. So I walk through each sale and I just add it to this dictionary. All right, I check to see if the entry is already in the dictionary. If it is, I add the sale amount to that particular country. Otherwise, I have to create the key to start with, the entry in that table. So this is a really basic method that just walks through and returns this thing. Now this does return a dictionary, so I'm going to go ahead and be specific about that so that LINQ will be more friendly to me. This way my expression up here, revenue by country, will have an interesting type that I can use in my LINQ expressions. Alright, so now we need to add attributes for our actual revenue. So let's add an attribute for overall sales. And we're going to go with we're going to drill into our data here. We're going to get to the table that actually holds our revenue. And we're just going to sum it up. We're going to sum up each one of these entries. For each one of these entries, we're going to get a pair, which is a key value pair representing the country code and the revenue that came from that country. So we're going to sum up just the values of those, just the amounts. And that should represent our overall revenue. So we've got that attribute in there now. And let's go up and generate a revenue output for domestic and foreign. Actually, let's just do domestic first. So we're going to basically do the same thing, but we're going to limit this query so that it only looks at U.S. sales. Now, I'm in the U.S., so that's domestic for me, so let's go with that. Where pair goes to pair.key is in the U.S. Right, so we'll only sum up the U.S. ones. And now technically there is only one U.S. entry in there because it's already a sum. But I'm going to keep this query very, very simple and very parallel so that it's easy to read. And we say not equal U.S. here, and then we just get foreign. So it makes it really easy to read. Now the output we require to have country breakdowns. So if you think about it, our table that we have in our code actually does, revenue by country has those breakdowns. So what we need to do now at this point in our query is drop down into that table and start outputting elements instead of attributes. So we're going to go into month data.revenue by country, and we're going to drop down into it. We're going to select, for each one of these pairs that comes out of here, we're going to generate a new element that gives the actual breakdown. So new X element, we're going to output that into the stream. Country is the name of that element. And we're going to have a couple of attributes. We need to have the country code and the revenue for that country. So we need to have two attributes, code, and in this case it's just the key of that pair that gives us the country code. And then we have another attribute called revenue, and that's the value of that pair. Okay, nothing really earth-shattering here. And now when this is all done, we need to start closing all these things up. And once again, brace matching is very helpful for this. We can see now we've closed all the way up to this element here, this period, but we need to close even further beyond that, all the way up to this original element here. So brace matching is very helpful when we're doing LINQ. It almost starts to feel a little bit like Lisp. Now, one thing that's very cool about this structure is that you can see where your data is coming from, and you can see how it's being formatted, and you can easily make changes. One thing you could do here is you could modify this report slightly to sort these countries by their code. So you could simply say order by, take your pair, goes to pull out the key you want to order by, pair.key, which is the country code, and now you've got a set of elements that are ordered by country code. Or if you wanted to, you could order it based on, for example, descending based on the amount of revenue that's being generated. So you see the top countries first. There's a lot of different ways that you can play with this, but what's nice about this is that you can just look at this and see the structure of your output and see where the data is coming from. So you see there's an outer element called widget sales. There's next we're inputting as an argument to that. The second argument to this is the stuff that goes inside of that element. So we're selecting some stuff and transforming it into another element called period, which we're going to have several of these because it's got a range of months. So we're going to have several child elements called period with 4 attributes on them. There's the 4 attributes and how they're computed. And then we have underneath that, we have child elements. After this attribute, we're dropping in a bunch of elements, country elements, and they themselves have attributes. So it's very easy to see the structure of the document, to modify the way it's computed, and it's just very flexible. Alright, so in this first video I've shown you how to use LINQ to XML to take some sales data, for example, and generate a nicely formatted report like this.